Hello, and welcome to this ADB Safeguard Policy Review and Update consultation. Today is the final consultation on land acquisition, land use restriction, and involuntary resettlement. My name is Azim Manji, and a hearty warm welcome to all of those who are joining us from across Europe and North America and elsewhere today. A few gentle reminders before we start. If you don't mind, please start the meeting by entering your name, designation, and the organization you represent into the chat box. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area, ensuring your audio and video are working, but remain off until Risha asks you to turn it on and make your contribution. Put your microphone on mute when you're not speaking, but when you're asked to do so, please turn it on and also turn your video on. To make a contribution or share your experience, you may also virtually raise your hand on the Zoom feature by clicking the reaction button at the bottom of your screen and then clicking on the raise hand emoji. Please be respectful to other joining participants and also be conscious of the agreed agenda as per Risa's instructions. Normally, we would have simultaneous interpretations, but as we're all English speakers today, there is no such facility. To raise your hand, you can see on the right column in orange how to activate the raise hand feature by clicking the reaction button and then the raise hand emoji. A reminder to unmute yourself, and please also start your video when making your contribution. A few gentle reminders before we start, and a restatement of ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. This Safeguard Policy Review and Update is in Phase 2, and the consultations are meant to provide opportunities for stakeholders such as yourself to express your views and opinions on the ADB's environmental and social safeguards. We aim to do this in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. As stakeholders, you're encouraged to articulate your project-related inputs and concerns during these sessions. A reminder that all of these sessions are being recorded and documented. This allows the ADB to respond to and ensure the accuracy and transparency of the deliberations before they're released publicly. All types of project feedback are welcome and will not and shall not lead to any retaliation, abuse, or any other kinds of discrimination. If you have any issues or concerns on the confidentiality, the potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through safeguardsupdate@adb.org. That email address is being flashed on your screen now. A reminder of today's agenda: Mr. Bruce Dunn will deliver the Safeguard Policy Statement, a review of the Safeguard Policy Statement of 2009, and an overview of the update process that will take us through these consultations, lasting us to about April 2022. The Safeguard Requirement Number 2, Involuntary Resettlement Safeguard, and a review of the process will be delivered by Zahuri Hairapatian, standing in for Ms. Irina Novikova. Both are Senior Social Development Specialists within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. The study's co-author, Mr. Ralph Starkloff, will then provide the study findings and key issues. We will then go directly into a moderated discussion facilitated by Ms. Risha Jones, a consultant with ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. We'll then have a brief break before going into the second moderated discussion, again facilitated by Ms. Risha Jones, a consultant to the ADB. We'll then have a very brief event evaluation prior to handing it over to Mr. Bruce Dunn again, Director of the Safeguards Division, by providing an overview and a direction on the way forward. So with that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Bruce Dunn, Director of the Safeguards Division, to offer his welcome remarks. Bruce, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim. Good day and welcome to everyone that's joining this session today. Really happy that you're able to join us for this regional consultation for civil society organisations and other non-governmental stakeholders from Europe and North America. Today's topic is on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. Now, I see so far we have about 22 people on the call. Relatively small number in comparison to some of the other consultations that we've had on this topic so far. This is actually the fifth session on involuntary resettlement that we've had over the course of the past week. And actually we've had really tremendous engagement in this topic. We've had more than 300 participants in the various consultations, including from government and non-government and civil society. So it's great that we've had such strong participation. Of course, today we're looking forward to having further good discussions. We had 22 registered participants from today, excluding ADB. So I do hope that we'll have more people joining the session fairly shortly. But of course, even with a small number of participants, it gives us an opportunity to have good quality discussions and dialogue. So, of course, wherever you're joining from, we're looking forward to your participation in this session. Of course, also to remind you, this is the sixth topic that we're holding so far. Sorry, I'm losing my words. This is the sixth thematic consultation topic that we've held in this series of regional consultations for the Safeguard Policy Update. We have at the moment a series of 16 topics that we're going to be holding consultations on between November 2021 this year and April 2022 next year. So, I have to thank many of you that are joining this session that have joined many other sessions. We're looking forward to having, your engagement throughout the process. Now, we've launched the policy update in August last year, and we're intending to implement the policy update process over a 2.5-year period, and we're targeting approval of the new policy by March 2023. So we still have about 16 months to continue the process with further consultations. And then, of course, we'll be developing the draft policy and then going into further rounds of consultations. That's likely to start from the second half of next year. Now, for today's session, we're going to be focusing, as I said, on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. This is one of the most challenging and often contentious areas with respect to any development project. Of course, having to be relocated or have impacts on people's livelihoods due to impacts on land creates a major disruption in anyone's life. It's something that we need to undertake very carefully and sensitively. It's something that, the ADB, we are really seeking to strengthen the policy in regard to this and improve practice. And what we're aiming for is really to be able to apply international good practices and provide, really value add to this process, working with our developing member countries and private sector clients. Now, some of the challenges that we've been facing with involuntary resettlement was identified through an evaluation of the Safeguard Policy Statement by our independent evaluation department. They found that overall, actually, the involuntary resettlement experiences at ADB had been positive and satisfactory, but they did note that our focus has largely been on the provision of compensation for affected people. And they highlighted several challenges. Importantly was the need to improve the process through more meaningful consultation and stakeholder engagement, as well as strengthening focus on the improvement of livelihoods and income restoration, particularly for the severely affected poor and vulnerable households. Now, building on this work of the IED, the team at ADB, the Safeguards Division, has been undertaking a lot of internal consultations within our own practitioners to review the implementation experiences and to look at what we think are the challenges and how we think that we could strengthen the policy. And of course, these consultations with you and civil society, as well as our developing member countries, are all about getting your perspectives on that process. We've identified a number of issues, and you'll be hearing more about those during the presentations today. For example, we certainly acknowledge the need for providing greater clarity in the safeguard requirements and provisions of the policy. This includes more details on how the policy should be implemented by our borrowers and clients, but also clarifying more in terms of the roles and responsibility of ADB. Also, we recognise the need for improving the overall planning and assessment processes for land acquisition, and this includes giving greater consideration to gender issues and impacts to poor and vulnerable people. And I might add there also that one of the things certainly we've been hearing in some of the consultations to date is the need to look more comprehensively at what we might call the mitigation hierarchy in terms of opportunities to avoid impacts, which is certainly something we do already, but it's an area where we need to give more attention to, and that's certainly an issue that we recognise. Thirdly, is not only strengthening stakeholder engagement, but also improving grievance redress mechanisms, and looking at how we can have a more continuous engagement with stakeholders to address their needs and concerns throughout the project cycle. Then, of course, strengthening implementation, which includes monitoring and oversight, including the role of ADB, but the borrowers and clients, and then also looking at opportunities to have more third-party and independent oversight, particularly where you have more high-risk projects or significant number of people that are being affected. And then lastly, we need to strengthen the integration between environmental and social safeguards. So a number of issues that we need to look at. Of course, this is just a snapshot, and my colleagues in a few moments will provide further details. We're going to have, as you've seen from the agenda, a short presentation providing a bit more details on the existing policy, as well as further information on the findings of the Independent Evaluation Department. My colleague Zaruhi will be presenting that. She's a social development specialist within the Safeguards Division at ADB. She'll be giving that presentation, and then that will be followed by Mr. Russ Starkloff, who will be presenting on the findings of the benchmarking study. So again, look, thank you very much to everyone that's joining today. Looking forward to hearing your views and your recommendations. And with that, I'll now pass over to Zaruhi for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I will present the overall overview on ADB Involuntary Resettlement Safeguards and the review process that we already initiated and will undertake during the upcoming several months. Next slide, please. First, and very briefly, I would like to outline some fundamentals of the SPS and the Involuntary Resettlement Safeguards. SPS has been effective since 2010 for the last 11 years, and it covers three main areas, safeguards areas: environment, involuntary resettlement, and indigenous people. The mitigation hierarchy, which you see on the left-hand side of the slide, is the guiding principle of SPS to avoid adverse impacts of the projects on environment and affected people where possible. If it's not possible, then to minimize through exploring the design alternatives. And then if there are still impacts, to mitigate and compensate them. SPS provides additional requirements on different lending modalities, and it also contains a prohibited investment activities list. Next slide, please. So involuntary resettlement policy applies to all ADB financed and administered sovereign and non-sovereign projects, and also to the actions which are conducted in anticipation of ADB financing. IR safeguard is structured in the following way. It has the following elements: objectives, scope and triggers, and also fundamental 12 policy principles. Then principles are followed by policy delivery process description and the roles and obligations of the borrower and the client to follow the principles. Next slide, please. Here again, you can see the mitigation hierarchy and key requirements and principles. We are sharing them for reference so that we can just inform our discussion after the sessions are presented on how to better improve and implement based on your project experience. Policy triggers in case of physical and economic displacement related to involuntary land acquisition, involuntary land use restrictions, and the restriction of access to the resources. And it's important to note that it covers both full, partial, permanent, and temporary impacts. As you know, fundamental principle starts with a screening and categorization and the assessment of involuntary settlement impacts. Then there is a requirement for involuntary settlement planning process, for continuous stakeholder engagement and meaningful consultations, and also establishment of the GRM, which are followed by fundamentals on restoration of livelihoods through replacement compensation for the affected assets, and which is very important, not to displace economically or physically prior to payment of the compensation. In general, final principle is to monitor the process, monitor the outcomes, and disclose the monitoring reports. Next slide, please. As Bruce already mentioned, independent evaluation department conducted an evaluation survey on involuntary resettlement safeguard implementation, and it finds the implementation satisfactory overall. However, it emphasizes an over-reliance on cash compensation. The evaluation further calls for strengthened application of livelihood restoration and better focus on vulnerable populations, such as people with disabilities, poor, landless, and others. The evaluation also calls for better consultations with affected persons, in particular in sovereign operations, and underlined more meaningful disclosure of mitigation measures in accessible local languages. The key recommendations include development of an integrated approach on risk assessment in the projects and subsequently project categorization. The application of a numerical threshold of 200 affected persons, which designates a project as category A, is judged as inadequate. And in the further presentations, we will unpack that a little bit more. The evaluation further recommends developing enhanced policy mechanisms to assess overall social risks in projects. Such overall social risks may lead to impacts on communities and people and their livelihood systems. but impacts do not originate from land acquisition and land use restriction. This recommendation calls for an integrated environment and social impact assessment as an umbrella tool organizing all project-related impact assessments and mitigations plan. And this is something that already exists in the requirements of all other multilateral financial institutions. With that, let me to update you on the Involuntary Resettlement Safeguards policy update process. Yes, next slide, please. So, this year, ADB has conducted a comparative study of land acquisition requirements across the KMFIs, which started after several consultations internally in ADB to examine implementation issues related to land acquisition. In addition to it, ADB launched a couple of complementary studies, one on valuation and the other one on livelihood restoration to inform development of guidance materials related to land acquisition. And that studies are now under implementation. And we would like to see what are the challenges DMCs are facing during the processes of valuation and also livelihood restoration. What are the good practices there and what could be replicated in the other projects to inform the development of guidance materials to supplement the SPS update process. Now, ADB is conducting a series of thematic consultations, which will allow us to collect also external inputs in the SPS update. And today, with the next session, we would like to present initial findings of the background research and discussions we had so far internally in ADB. And I would like to pass over to our colleague, Ralph Starkle, who is the Senior Social Development Consultant and former ADB staff, who will present the main findings and recommendations. Over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everybody, or good morning in North America. I will look at some of the main findings of the benchmark study. You can find more detail in the summary which we have disclosed alongside with this consultation, and a comparative matrix which is rather more comprehensive. It will be contained in the study report, which we will share early next year. Thereafter, I will look at several key issues which have emerged from internal consultations and workshops among social safeguard specialists at ADB, and which we consider to be critical for the SPS update. Next slide, please. So in looking at the objectives and scope of application, ADB shares with other MFIs the objectives of avoiding and minimizing adverse IR impacts. Of course, the mitigation of adverse land acquisition impacts, which is based on the replacement principle, is shared as well. Other MFIs include among the policy objectives the avoidance of forced eviction, compensation at replacement cost, and stakeholder engagement. The comparator MFIs give thereby greater prominence to the requirements for compensation at replacement cost and for stakeholder engagement, in addition to avoiding forced evictions. However, ADB addresses replacement cost and stakeholder engagement, of course, within safeguards requirements too for involuntary resettlement. Some MFIs include requirements for voluntary land transactions to some degree, such as voluntary land donations, EBRD and the World Bank provide for that, but in general, the MFIs exclude land acquisition by non-compulsory means from the scope of applicability of their land acquisition standards. Some MFIs allow the application, no, I'm in the wrong line, I'm sorry for that. Some MFI include requirements for voluntary land transactions. We have that, I'm sorry, we also have a bit of consultation fatigue at this point in the night. We need to talk about livelihood impacts not resulting from land acquisition. Some MFIs allow for that. EBRD and IFC apply the standard to social impacts not caused by land acquisition, land use restriction, while ADB addresses these under the environmental impact assessment process, which to some extent lacks an explicit provision for a social impact assessment and commensurate mitigation measures. In terms of classification categorization, except for ADB, all the MFIs have adopted a risk-based integrated environmental and social assessment. The risk-based assessment looks at socioeconomic, legal, institutional, and country context. The comparator MFIs do not use the numerical threshold for categorization of land acquisition, land use restriction, which ADB employs. You would be familiar with the requirement that if there are more than 200 persons with significant impacts, the project will be classified as category A. Next slide, please. All the MFIs require the preparation of varying types of resettlement planning documents, which are to be commensurate with the level of displacement. The use of a resettlement framework is permitted by all MFIs, including ADB. However, ADB limits the use of frameworks to 4 finance modalities. The other MFIs allow an across-the-board application of the framework approach to all types of loan modalities. However, ADB restricts these to sector programs, multi-tranche financing facilities, emergency loans, and as an exceptional option to standalone projects with non-significant impacts. All MFIs have adopted stakeholder engagement provisions, some in a standalone standard, and these require the disclosure of relevant information about displacement impacts and mitigation measures in local languages and in accessible, culturally appropriate manner. Some MFIs detail the kind of information which is required. This involves also the persons to be included in the stakeholder engagement process and the duration during the process cycle, including the consideration of an alternative project design and options for relocation and livelihood restoration, information about displaced persons' rights and entitlements, consideration of the concerns and interests of women, men, and all vulnerable persons. It is to be applied or carried out throughout planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of mitigation of impacts, with full documentation of the entire SE process in the planning and monitoring and evaluation documents. Except for ADB, none of the MFIs explicitly require the full disclosure of resettlement documents on their websites. Next slide, please. ADB also explicitly mandates the public disclosure of monitoring reports on its website. to ensure verification of the completion of resettlement plan implementation, especially for category 8 type projects. Other MFIs may require land acquisition completion reports or external compliance reviews. ADB does not require standalone completion audits or reports, but mandates ongoing monitoring and evaluation and discloses the completion of resettlement implementation in project completion reports. The division of roles and responsibilities between ADB and the borrower and the other MFIs and the borrower is comparable. MFIs undertake screening, due diligence, supervision, support, and capacity building, while the borrowers are expected to implement all requirements for safeguard management of the standards. Next slide, please. Now, looking at some of the key issues which we would like to consider and on which we would hope to get your feedback, I would like to first look at the architecture and integration approach that has been adopted by many comparators. We also are considering the adoption of a performance standard approach with binding requirements for borrowers and ADB, including all their staffs, with clarification of differential roles and responsibilities for the management of land acquisition and land use restrictions. The adoption of a risk-based approach to screening, scoping, and categorization of land acquisition and land use restriction without a numerical threshold has been favored in our discussions and consultations among ADB safeguard specialists. And the adoption of an integrated environmental and social impact assessment as an overarching assessment tool to cover all anticipated social risks and impacts of a project with the specific requirements for land acquisition, land use restriction would complement this approach. The adoption of the performance standard approach, a risk-based approach, and integrated ESIA seeks an alignment and harmonizations with the other MFIs. The 200+ persons threshold for significant land acquisition impacts is too arbitrary and does not necessarily reflect the real level of impact severity. Factors such as the vulnerability of DPs and the capacity of the borrower's agency are among the critical contextual factors to be considered. The integration of all social impacts and the interconnectedness of environmental and social factors and impacts needs to be considered. Next slide, please. Give me a second, I lost my computer here. All right. In terms of the scope of application, we propose to look at both involuntary and voluntary forms of land use restrictions and land acquisition. We would like to improve practices for both and provide clearer guidance. The safeguards requirements for voluntary land acquisition would establish ground rules and minimum requirements, including an assessment of whether it is truly voluntary and the application of the replacement principle. This would address increasingly popular land acquisition modes among some of our member countries and partner agencies, such as sales among willing buyers and sellers, leasing of land, land donations, land pooling, and land swapping, as well as consensual land use restriction for natural resource management projects. We also propose to better clarify provisions related to land use restriction and restriction on access. We frequently encounter the need for restriction of access and land use due to both natural resource management and infrastructure projects, both temporarily and permanently, and therefore should include better clarification in the land acquisition standard. We also propose to improve the clarification of the provisions for social impacts of associated facilities and existing facilities, legacy issues, and cumulative impacts, and their mitigation. The inclusion of social impacts for the applicability of the land acquisition standard for associated facilities, for example, is critical to ensure consistency of application of ADB safeguard standards and requires additional clarification. At the moment, this is only handled under the environmental safeguards requirements. And we want to clarify further provisions for mitigation of livelihood impacts and asset losses not caused by land acquisition. The application of the LA standard to social impacts, especially livelihood impacts due to impacts not caused by land acquisition, will allow ADB to address adverse impacts with adequate social impact assessments and mitigation measures based on the replacement principle. It would require the engagement of social science expertise. Among the types of impacts of concern are, for example, project-induced changes in the structure and functioning of natural resource systems on which affected persons depend, including primary ecosystem services. The construction of bypasses avoiding the locations of local businesses, damages to assets due to construction activities, restriction of access to productive land by a linear infrastructure project, or increases in the cost of living or business due to the presence and or interventions of a project. Next slide, please. We also would like to see a better linkage between project design readiness of the technical design and the planning of land acquisition and land use restriction. ADB in general favors the approval of a project when detailed design of project facilities has been accomplished and implementation ready resettlement plans are in place. However, we find that many projects are approved with draft plans only, and this wastes resources available for assessment and planning because these need to be repeated during implementation for the final land acquisition plans. Therefore, as an exception measure, we are considering a broader application of the framework approach to all known modalities, but with strict safeguards, including detailed scoping in the field by ADB and the implementing agencies, and the prohibition of civil works until implementation-ready land acquisition plans are accomplished. We want to see a close synchronization of the design of the project facilities with land acquisition planning at field level in close cooperation of the respective experts. There are a number of points that require further clarification in the policy. All of these, or most of these, have been addressed in the current SPS, but I think we can do better and provide our clients with clearer guidance on issues such as the valuation of lost assets, livelihood restoration, which IED found to be a weak element in our implementation of the land acquisition safeguards requirements. The relocation of non-title displaced persons is a critical issue because the repetition of squatting occurs particularly in urban contexts where there is limited space for people to settle or undertake livelihood activities. We want to see better clarification of provisions for addressing vulnerability and the inclusion of all genders in the stakeholder engagement and mitigation measures. We want to see clearer provisions for mitigation measures for host communities affected by resettlement sites. We think we need to have better and stronger capacity building provisions for our partners. And we would like to strengthen external monitoring by adding a provision for third-party monitoring in critical projects, in projects with compliance issues, with lack of clarity of future potential impacts, and ADB would then field third-party monitoring experts. I think I close at this point. Thank you very much. And I hand over to Azim, who will now introduce the consultation discussion sessions.
Thank you so much for that, Ralph. And thank you also, Zahuri. And thank you, Bruce, for your oversights, your overviews, rather, I'm sorry, comments and contributions. We have a reasonably manageable group in our presence today, and the hope is that through the facilitated moderated discussion by Resha, we can perhaps hear from everybody in the audience today and get into some real depth to get to the clarity and specificity that Ralph, you requested, and perhaps even into more detailed practical discussions on the adoption of a framework for performance standards and the risk-based approaches. So before we actually go to that, I would like to just briefly mention that we will be having two polls just immediately after Resha's second facilitated discussion, so part 2 of the moderation. The first will be a Menti poll, which is a narrative question, and we are going to be asking you what specific improvements can be made to these consultations to improve the efficacy, to improve the level of discourse and engagement with you, the stakeholders, and you're free to provide 3, 4, 5 sentences on that. We'd really like to hear from you, and we'd really like to have an idea of how the level of constructive engagement can be improved. That question is being flashed up on the chat box now. Feel free to go to that link, or if you have the Menti app downloaded on your device, you can tap in the poll question number and go directly to it and provide your responses, or you can just simply click on the link at any time between now and up to, say, 1 hour after this consultation closes. But now I would like to turn over to Resha Jones, who is a senior social development specialist as a consultant within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. Resha, if you could take us through the part 1 of the moderated discussion, we'd all be very grateful. So over to you, Resha.
Thank you, Azim, and welcome everyone to part 1 of our moderated discussion. So the session today is on involuntary land acquisition and resettlement. So I'd please ask that we keep to this topic. You can see some guiding questions up on your screen. Next slide, please. These are to help sort of frame some of our discussion for today. So what to expect from the SPS update for the proposed standard on land acquisition? What issues do you think need to be covered, and what changes would you like to see? And as Azim mentioned, we hopefully have some time tonight to hear from everyone and to get into a bit more depth on this topic. Now, if you are sharing project challenges, I just ask that if you could also provide us some recommendations or suggestions for how you think we could improve the policy based on those challenges, that would be incredibly helpful. Now, the order I'll be going in for this session, first I'll take raised hands, and then we haven't got any questions in advance tonight, so then I'll be moving to questions posed in the chat box. So go back to the previous slide for me, thank you. So based on these guiding questions, let's kick off. So please go ahead and raise your hand or type into the chat box now, and I'll go through one by one, thanks. So looking to hear suggestions. Knud, you are first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Feels a little bit like a déjà vu because I already was participating on Monday. So I try to keep it a little brief, but I think that the colleagues who are here for the first time might also hear what I'm saying. And yeah, first of all, let me say that I really welcome your approach, because I think that you're really putting a lot of work into it and come to good questions and hopefully also to good development. Let me say, first of all, although you speak of land acquisition and land use restrictions, which of course would cover resettlement, I would really recommend that you explicitly name resettlement in the new policy, because and maybe even the policy title, because yeah, this is what people understand much better when they deal with performance standards or safeguards. Yeah, and the one thing that we have been struggling with, and Bruce and Ralph and others already know it, is that we have done a survey of all 2,000 plus ADB projects and programs, and have looked where there was a resettlement in one way or the other. So from just merely loss of income for half a year up to resettlement of a very significant amount of people. And what we have found over the time frame from mid-2015 to the end of 2020 was that, to our calculation, around about 1 million people have been resettled in one way or the other, and that the documentation and so was very insufficient and confusing. So we really had to develop our own model of counting to really get the numbers together, and we really did a very, very conservative estimate. So like using 4 people for a household, where we know that in many countries a household is much bigger than just 4 people. And so there's a lot to be done in the development, but also in the supervision of those projects. The next thing is that I also mentioned is please leave the core responsibility for the whole due diligence process with the ADB, and don't go the path of other MDBs who put all responsibility, everything to the client, so that the client is then self-reporting, self-assessing, and you're just doing desk reviews of their reports. I think you won't go in that direction, but I just wanted to mention it. And the last thing, because I already spoke too long, is the issue of voluntary land acquisition. I already said that in many cases we had our doubts when we saw where voluntary land acquisition was happening, that the voluntary thing was really voluntary because of the political and socioeconomic environment of these countries. I leave it like that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Knud. Okay, so I think we're going to have a couple of people respond to your remarks. So I will start with Ralph on land use restriction and using the term resettlement. And Bruce, I'm going to call you in on some of the other items, especially on the core responsibilities for due diligence. Ralph, I think maybe you can also respond to the voluntary land acquisition component, and we'll look about who can talk more about the documentation as well. Okay, Ralph, over to you.
Yes, thank you. This issue of resettlement is one of my pet topics. And there is a proposal that we differ in nomenclature somewhat more radically from our comparators and maybe from our past. I understand that everybody is used to the term of resettlement or involuntary resettlement, but it can be rather misleading for a number of reasons. First of all, okay, let me start here. When I worked first time in Pakistan, an irrigation engineer with whom I was discussing involuntary resettlement said, man, we are not resettling these people. We are taking a little bit of their agricultural land for canal construction. Other people told me, oh, we are just widening the road. We are not relocating anybody. This is not resettlement. Why do you use this term? So this started my interest in looking into this. And we need to realize that relocation and resettlement as such is actually a form of mitigation of impacts caused by land acquisition or land use restriction, mainly land acquisition. And there can be economic displacement by losing assets, economic assets such as land and properties, and there can be livelihood impacts by losing jobs or losing resources that we use to generate livelihoods. Relocation occurs when we acquire land that people use and other properties, buildings that people use for either residential or business purposes, and we need to relocate their residences or we need to relocate their businesses. So if people find that the concept of resettlement ought to be in the name of the standard, then I would favor going with what the World Bank has done to discuss land acquisition, land use restriction, and involuntary resettlement in the title. I think that may be a good compromise, but what causes the impact is land acquisition and land use restriction. And if you look at the statistics, and I'll close with that, if you look at the statistics, which we don't have at our fingertip, and I agree with you, documentation needs to be improved here, but the educated guess is that land acquisition without relocation and without resettling people is the larger aspect, while actual resettlement would be a minority of affected persons, would affect a minority of displaced persons. Let me keep it at that. Maybe I can come back to the voluntary land acquisition later. I think Bruce has some very good ideas on improved documentation, and maybe he would like to discuss that.
Bruce, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Risha, and thank you, Kunad, for joining again today. I know you were in the other session that we ran a few days ago, and it is great to have an opportunity for follow-up. I'll mention a couple of things. Well, firstly, to say we are a small group here today. We've got a number of people from ADB on the call, but you know, civil society participants in this call, relatively small. So I think we can speak a little bit more, and we can, you know, have a bit of a discussion today, which is good. First thing, I know that you're undertaking the studies, and be very happy to engage with you further on that. You've shared already with us just sort of a short presentation with an outline of the methodology and some of the data and findings, which is very interesting. I think it'd be great for us to organise a bilateral call to go through that, to have a bit more of a discussion of the methodology and the findings, and take it from there. So that would be one thing that we should follow up on. I think Ralph's already in contact with you as well, so we can organise a bit more follow up there. I wanted to come though to your question now following up on Ralph's about the responsibilities. You mentioned that the core responsibilities for due diligence should be with ADB. And I think certainly a lot of the due diligence is with ADB, but maybe to borrow a term a little bit from the climate change world, there are somehow common but differentiated responsibilities. And just to unpack that a little bit, so certainly we see that the primary responsibility for implementation of the safeguards, and in this case around the involuntary resettlement work, is with the project proponent. In many cases, the ADB's developing member country, the borrower or clients, it could be the private sector. They have primary responsibilities for obviously doing the upfront assessment work, leading stakeholder engagement, implementation of resettlement plans, ensuring payment of compensation, etc. All of those aspects, really clearly need to be with the project owner. And then they have responsibility for ensuring, of course, that the domestic requirements, national laws are met, but also when entering into a legal agreement with ADB, they have responsibility to ensure that our policy is met according to the agreed resettlement plan. So that's clearly with them, and I think that's not a role that we can take on. They are the project owners and need to have that responsibility. Our role, though, is very clearly in terms of assessing and appraising the project. We need to do our due diligence from a very early stage in terms of screening the project. We do work, early stage in terms of the categorization. We also think, and you've heard from Ralph during the presentation, that we need to strengthen more detailed scoping of what needs to be done. And we then actively are working with the clients in terms of making sure that they understand our safeguard requirements and that those requirements are met through the project preparation and implementation stages. Our due diligence roles also involves, going out into the field and, meeting with people, and particularly with projects that would have the potential for significant impacts and risks. So category A, participating in consultations, making sure that they're being implemented, appropriately in a fair and meaningful way. These are some of the key roles that we do. As we go into implementation also, you've got to have monitoring structures in place where the client is obviously engaged in monitoring how implementation is going. Also, their engagement with grievance redress mechanisms and collecting data and monitoring that. We also have a monitoring role as well. Checking how that work is being done, reviewing monitoring reports, going out into the field again, having further discussions with clients, etc. So again, there's some commonality in terms of that role, but it's also differentiated in terms of the responsibilities, and we think that's important. It's not giving over full responsibility and with a check to the client. It's continuing to follow up that due diligence through the project cycle. So that's something that we need to obviously differentiate a bit more with the new policy. We'd like to make it clearer in terms of that distinction with the roles and responsibilities. But I'd be interested to hear from you also in terms of your views on what we sort of set out around. There are differentiated roles, and if you think there are roles that ADB should strengthen or continue to work on, then be interested to hear further thoughts on that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Ralph, would you like to chime in then on the voluntary land acquisition?
Yes, let me say a few words, but I also want to give Knut and others a chance to respond to what we've been saying and raise other issues. Yes, voluntary land acquisition in some cases can be a insincere and manipulative or even coercive matter. We understand your concern, and we do know of cases which we have followed up through our due diligence and corrective action process in our own projects. But we do see across the board increasing interest in many countries to use more voluntary, non-compulsory modes of land acquisition because it saves time. It prevents project delays, costly project delays where contractors get paid penalty monies because the courts are holding up a project because there are frustrated people under eminent domain-based land acquisition. So we feel we need to have some basic guidelines, some minimum requirements, and some procedures in place for the different types of voluntary land acquisition. It's a very elegant way if the client is willing to mobilize the resources outside the normal budgets for land acquisition under the land management departments. For private sector, in any case, voluntary land acquisition is a useful method because it again avoids complicated bureaucratic processes and demonstrating the public purpose under eminent domain. But we want to make sure that coercion is avoided. We want to make sure that the replacement principle is upheld. We want to make sure that people are not impoverished, and we would most surely avoid relocation unless there is a voluntary self-relocation involved. But again, that would require very detailed investigation to ensure that it doesn't adversely affect people and leads to loss of income, livelihood, and the quality of their lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. I know we haven't quite got to the piece around documentation, but I might ask Knut if he would like to respond at this point.
Yeah, I'll do that briefly. First of all, I already wrote into the chat that I would be fine with this compromise about the heading. That's perfectly fine. And let me just go to the issue of voluntary land acquisition. I think if it's done properly, then it's a perfect way of avoiding conflict, of getting things done better. But this also means that a prerequisite of this voluntary donation is a proper, free and prior informed process that also involves participation. So in a way, it's a more democratic way to move things forward, and that's good. But as you already said, there are circumstances where also private companies then hire land agencies who then hire some goons to convince people to better sell if they want to avoid broken bones or worse. So as we already discussed on Monday, a certain time period which should be assessed backwards from the actual land acquisition process to see what actually happened would be a good thing to do. And on the rest, we're looking forward to arrange something in January to discuss our research with you, and we're happy to cooperate with you.
Thank you, Knut. That's very appreciated, and we really appreciate your remarks and your suggestions today. Now, I think I might need to move to see if there's more hands raised or anyone has comments or suggestions or remarks in the chat box. So please go ahead and raise your hand if you would like to offer some suggestions or some remarks. around these guiding questions or more broadly on the topic of involuntary land acquisition. Dr. Nora, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. It seems that Urgewald is very prominent here. Thank you very much for these really interesting presentations, and I was fascinated how much work you put already in that. I would like to follow up on this involuntary resettlement. And as you know, I am a China specialist, so I really focus on China. And I would like to ask if you tackle on the local legal environments, which play a prominent role in the primary responsibility for due diligence, as if I understand correctly. So the local legal environment, for example, in China, for land acquisition is in theory that the individual farm household can sell their rights to use of the land directly to real estate developers, for example, or to private investors. But this is only in theory, because the local government really earns a lot of money. Last year it was $1.3 trillion only from land sales. So my question would be, how do you deal with these kind of written law and regulations and practiced land sales, and how do you monitor that? How do you pursue due diligence, for example, in China? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nora. So I'm going to hand this one over to Madhu. Madhu, would you like to tackle local laws and practices?
Sure. I mean, working in China for many years, yes, actually land sales is one of the key income of the local governments. There's no doubt about that. In China, there are three kinds of land. We know state-owned land, a land which is owned by the village collective, and another one is basically reserved land, which is also state-owned but reserved for specific purposes. Now, land from the farmers, there are various forms that it is taken. Now, if you look at the agricultural sector, a lot of the time the farmers actually, there are these local enterprises in the village as, part of the village collective. So village collectives invest through their local enterprises, where farmers would put in their land rights or put in their land because it is given on lease for 60 years, which is renewable. And in terms of the division of the land, it is each and every person and person in the village would have the same amount of land irrespective of gender. So that's given. So they would put in the land, and normally when it is a transfer of land use rights to that enterprise or the private enterprise that you are talking of, there are certain lease agreements that happens between the village collective and the farmers. Now, what we have seen is that there are laws and regulations. Now, these leases are taken for a long time, and the way they calculate is based on the number of years of annual output value of that particular land, and they would give the amount, since the farmer is not the owner of the land, so they would get their income, the gross income, basically. And that is done through contracts. When ADB tries and implements such project in China, what they try and do, they try and see the gaps in those contracts. They conduct a due diligence, because what happens is in those contracts, maybe the rates for the lease agreements are fixed for a period of maybe 10 years, 20 years, but obviously there's inflation, so ADB works on that. So this is at the project level, that's how it works. Now, I'll just give you an example also about land sales, because we all know that, yes, there is land sales and the government owns a lot of money, but it is also true that China has the, I think, the largest and the most highest value of compensation that the farmers actually get. and their calculation is based on the average annual output value of per capita land, and it is calculated over the period of lease that the farmer had. So basically, when we have a situation like that, we know that after the land take, the government obviously will give it to the private developers to develop some land. We had a case in Guangxi Wuzhou where there were about 2,000 households who used to live in a valley which was affected by geohazard disaster, and every monsoon, there would be landslides, mudslides, and there would be actually a lot of damage to their property. And people wanted to get out of that place because it also had a lot of risk to their lives. So every year during the monsoons, they were very, very scared. So the government wanted to resettle them. So we did that project. We resettled all those 2,000 households. And there was a huge, there was a very structured consultation process where the affected people were taught about their rights. They were explained in terms of what they will get in exchange. There were also poor, vulnerable households. If you calculate the compensation, maybe in exchange, the per square meter of house that they would get would not they would not be able to afford that in exchange of the compensation they would get. So the government also provided them with subsidized housing. Now, what happened? So after the people moved out of that geohazard area, it was a kind of a valley. So it was flattened and it was given to a private developer, obviously at a higher price. But people were also resettled in resettlement housing, which had all the facilities. And we also monitored that, how people resettled. Then there were also people who were resettled in an industrial area where they were also offered jobs. They were able to build houses and rent out houses. So it's a whole process. That project took about 8 years. And so we started the assessment and implemented it. So how do we assess whether it is in compliance with SPS? I think the most important thing that we see is whether the compensation that people got follows the resettlement cost principle, number one, whether their livelihoods were restored and improved. So that's how we assess. Now, in terms of the sales, resettlement cost money. The government also has to earn money. So, but the good thing in China is that when they give it to a private developer, there is a provision that the private developer also has to allocate some low-cost economy housing for the affected people. So that is also in their law. Another thing is that they have a very comprehensive planning. If they go for an urban development and expansion, they would not only assess the roads, all the facilities that it would be there, they would also assess how many people will be displaced and also have adequate budget for their resettlement, housing, and livelihood restoration. So for them, it is a more comprehensive planning. And if I really compare, the Chinese resettlement and for the other regions that we work in, they have a system. Firstly, they have very proactive regulations. They pay their farmers very well. The 12th five-year plan says that about 60% of the farmers will live in urban areas. So they ensured that there is this transition of jobs from farming to industrialization. They ensured that they have these TVET programs to develop those skills. So ADB's involvement has been in different sectors, including TVET, where we have also provided a lot of these retraining skills as well. Yeah, I would stop there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. Dr. Nora, would you like to respond back? Do you have anything?
Yes, only very, very, very briefly. Thank you for this very comprehensive lecture on China. It seems you have really very deep experiences. I just wonder if everything would be so perfect. Everybody is getting a job and they are trained and they have the highest compensations and so on. It sounds to me a little bit like happiness sheet written by the local and central government of China. Sorry that I have to say that, because from my perspective or our perspective, we had different experiences, and I also asked myself why there are these nail houses which were there some years ago, and also now, as you probably know, there is very limited space for people to speak out during the last years. I lived in China also a long time, and I know the changes. So it would be great if it's like you just told us. And yeah, I think we have to go deeper into this topic, perhaps in another session where we can perhaps provide some more evidence from the ground, from the other side, if it's possible. It's, as I said, it's more and more difficult in China to get these informations. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree, Nora. You know, the thing is, you know, they have the regulations there, the process is there. One thing that we always insisted in projects was the socioeconomic assessment, you know. So that part was always ADB's value addition in our projects that we had implemented. So yes, you know, there are also regional and provincial differences. There are some provinces, as you know, they have their central regulation, and then they have their local provincial regulation, and then they have the local regulation. So there are variations in, you know, in the provinces where we had to do even gap filling analysis and fill up the gaps. But the bottom line is that they have regulations. The only thing is that we have to ensure that they implement their own regulations that are there. So that has to be, you know, traced. So we always insist in our projects in China that we actually read the regulations carefully and insist that they implement them as well as fill up the gaps. So it's like you follow that very closely. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Madhu. And on that note, I'm going to ask Azim to take us to our break. I can see Bruce is waving his hand. Bruce, do you mind jumping in after our 5-minute break?
Yeah, sure. No, it's just going to add in a little bit after Nora's comments, but we can come back to that after the break, no problem.
Perfect. Azim, over to you.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Risha, as well, for that moderated discussion. Very, very lively. We're going to just take a 5-minute break, as Risha mentioned. Before we actually go to the break, a reminder that we do have the Menti poll that I'd be very grateful. It's up on the screen now in the chat box, as you see. If you just give it some thought, you can respond later. You can respond now during the break as you wish. We've got a countdown timer on the slide that will provide the guiding questions for the next round of questions, as you can see on your screen now. The countdown timer will start, and when it gets down to 0, it's a notice and an indication that we should be returning to our screens, as well as when the music starts to fade away for an extended period of time, that should also be an indication that we return to our screens. So with that, we will take a brief break. Stretch your legs if you need to, grab a glass of something refreshing, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes for round 2 with Risha and the moderated discussion. Thank you very much. And welcome back, everybody. Let me reintroduce Risha Jones again to take over round 2 with a set of different guiding questions for the moderated discussion and a reminder of what Bruce has suggested, that this is a real opportunity to have a bit more of an engaged and intimate dialogue on some of these issues. So we welcome everybody's participation. With that, let me turn it over to Risha, please.
Thank you, Azim. Okay, so this brings us to our round 2 of our moderated discussion. Now, you can see on the slide that there are some guiding questions here, which we're looking to get some more depth on as we move forward with updates to the policy. So the first, and we've touched on this a little bit already, is around covering both voluntary and involuntary land acquisition, using more of an integrated risk assessment and categorization for the whole of the project for environmental and social, including land acquisition, matching planning requirements with the readiness of technical design. So making sure that these match more closely with cycles, addressing impacts on livelihoods that are not caused by land acquisition, as well as monitoring compliance. So whilst I'll let people start to formulate perhaps their questions or remarks around these topics, and in the meantime, I'll ask Bruce if you'd like to come online and respond briefly back to Dr. Nora's comments.
Thank you, Risha, and welcome back. Thanks for coming back to join us again. Yeah, no, just very briefly, I appreciate, Dr. Nora, your further comments there. You know, obviously, you know, in the PRC, it can't all be rosy in terms of implementation, like in any country. I think Madhu, from her own very in-depth experience there, has sort of clearly set out, you know, there's good regulations, there's good process, implementation capacity is weak, but, you know, certainly issues. So, yeah, be very happy to have further information from your experiences where you think that need to strengthen processes more. I mean, my own experience there, to be very honest, is, you know, generally implementation is quite good, but stakeholder engagement has certainly got challenges in terms of being truly meaningful. You mentioned around, I think broadly, you know, the space for civil society to be vocal. You know, consultation happens, but could it be more meaningful? I think that is an area to certainly look at and to strengthen, and an area where we could certainly make clearer in the new policy. Grievance redress mechanisms as well. I think there's a tendency to view them perhaps in a negative sense, that complaints are a bad thing. And so there's a tendency to say, no, we don't have any complaints on projects, whereas grievance redress mechanisms are not intended for that purpose. They're there as a way to resolve issues and to provide a voice and to improve projects. And I think we have to also articulate quite clearly for clients the benefits of well-functioning grievance redress mechanisms and incentives for those to be operating, and incentives to have full disclosure around the issues there. So I think that's two areas certainly where more work is needed, but you know, again, be interested to hear further from you. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd go now to requesting people to raise their hands if they'd like to remark, comment on these topics, or please go ahead and type into the chat box as well. Okay, Shushan, please go ahead.
Good evening, dear colleagues. My name is Shushan Kocharian. I'm working at Road Department Fund. We are working with ADB finance projects, for example, the North-South Corridor. I will just tap the video, okay? So I have some questions, if I can ask. The most relevant issues that we have in our projects with financed by the ADB that we face too are some clarifications on definition of vulnerable groups, assessment of vulnerable groups, and mitigation approaches. This is the first question. It would be better, for example, to have more capacity building. It will be done with PIUs and ministry by the ADB. The second question that I have, it is how to work when we have co-financing agencies. For example, in North-South corridor, we have two donor banks, ADB and EIB, for tranche 3, for example. And the third question I have, it is about the indirect impacts, which cause big problems for us and are source of the grievances. And we need guidance how to assess, how to define, and what to do with this problem. And for example, we have a business unit who has utilities that are impacted by the project, but the utilities are have much bigger units that the land acquisition, how to say, area is needed. So what can we do with this rest of the utilities, and how we can approach with these issues? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shushan. Okay, so first off, I can really hear that you're having some challenges on your project at the moment. And so the first thing I'm going to say is that we're going to have someone from the operations department reach out to you, especially around that piece around the indirect impacts causing lots of problems and being the main source of grievances. So now there's some other topics that you touched on. Can I just clarify the definition of vulnerable? Are you talking about the definition in the current SPS, or are you inquiring about the definition potentially in the future update?
Both.
Okay, both. Okay,
yes.
So, right. Okay, and so I'm going to give that one to Ralph, and Bruce, I'm going to ask you to respond on the co-financing.
I think Zara agreed to respond.
Zara. Okay, sorry, I didn't see that.
She is
Zara?
very versed in this context.
Okay, sure thing. Zara, over to you then.
Thank you. There were several questions raised. Maybe I will cover vulnerability. And the first question was vulnerability and indirect impacts, and colleagues may contribute on the co-financing projects and issues with that, and also on capacity development. Yeah, I recall. So regarding assessment of the vulnerability and respective mitigations, the livelihood restoration survey that we have mentioned is also looking at the social impact assessment of vulnerable groups and approaches to mitigate the restoration of their livelihood. So we assume that based on the findings of the survey, there would be guidelines materials prepared to support the updated policy, and there would be more guidance to the implementing agencies on the overall assessment process for vulnerable groups and mitigation. As for the indirect impacts, as Ralph mentioned during his presentation, this is the issue we really acknowledge, and it is faced in different projects face this in different countries. And we are considering to have some approach to cover indirect impacts, to have an opportunities for EAs to mitigate impacts from indirect impacts as well. But we do acknowledge that there is a need for clarification on what type of indirect impacts could be mitigated and considered under the safeguards policy. Maybe Bruce may come in for the capacity building. to the EAs and ministries. To be true, we are getting these questions throughout the round of consultations, and other countries are also raising the issue of need of capacity building.
Thanks, Zara. So Bruce, capacity building and co-financing.
Great. Thank you very much, Risha, Zara, and Shushan. Happy to answer that. I'll start with the capacity building on the last point. So obviously very crucial, and most often the type of capacity building that we do is something that's built in incrementally to projects. So you've identified that there might be a certain capacity gap, and you would provide maybe some additional technical assistance or consultant services to be able to address that. But it's incremental, and it tends to be built temporarily in the context of the project, but not necessarily in the longer term, strengthening institutions. Of course, we do that as well through our wider technical assistance, either at a national level or sometimes at regional levels, where we have these regional technical assistants that provide support out to multiple countries. But it's very clear that there's a huge demand for that, and we'd like to be able to strengthen the support services that we provide. Certainly under the new policy, and there can be new areas or additional requirements that could come in with a new policy, where we're already starting to look at, how do we support that through a comprehensive rollout program that, starts with training and online learning materials, but then can roll out to, country by country, and also sectors that need additional support. We'd like to, as part of that, also strengthen the relationships with what we do in our country partnership strategies and our knowledge dialogues that we're now having as part of our country partnership strategies. So where there are issues, agreed issues, where either coming from the government clients that you would like to have support in certain areas, or where we're working and we're seeing some consistent challenges, maybe in a certain sector or with certain issues, that we can agree at that country partnership level that over a period of time we will work on these issues, and then we can allocate resources for it. There's also potential to do wider scale institutional reforms, say policy reforms around issues like, say, land acquisition, involuntary resettlement laws, or it could be, of course, on other topics. We have what we call policy-based lending. Other institutions may call it, development policy loans, but we have these mechanisms, and we use them a lot in other areas, say, financial sector reform, where we work to support the government through a process of policy reform, and often with technical assistance accompanying that to support implementation. These are things that we could also be doing in the context of better environmental and social safeguard systems and capacity with governments, where you're wanting to strengthen those systems and capacity. So I think there's a wide range of opportunities, and it's certainly something we want to look at and provide more support with as we go to the rollout of the new policy. Next, I'll mention on co-financing. So now typically here, ADB would enter in discussions with a co-financier, and of course with the borrower or client. And we would normally enter into a co-financing agreement or some form of a memorandum of understanding with the co-financier around, of course, the financial aspects, but also on issues like the implementation of safeguards. We've done some work on this actually between the multilateral financial institutions, with a view that we should work collectively to harmonize and streamline the implementation of safeguards for our clients. So, there's sort of an agreement, an onus on us to actually collaborate together. It's always challenging, we know, for our clients when we come with different requirements. There is a lot of convergence, of course, between our policies, but then there are differences. And if we're asking for additional sets of documentations that are slightly different, different sets of requirements, different procedures, or different timing of that documentation, it obviously becomes more challenging. So it's of course better if we can agree on the implementation of a common approach or a common practice. Where there's differences, usually we'd look for the higher standard to be applied, or if there's a gap, a difference between one policy standard and another, then obviously you need to fill that for that institution. But it's definitely an area where we need to work on more. We'd like to have more provisions in the safeguard policy around co-financing, including, I would say, potentially the ability to use the standards of another co-financer if they're equivalent or materially consistent to our own. That's something that we have to discuss more with stakeholders and our board, but it's certainly something that we think we should consider. So I'll stop there, and Shashank, you may have further questions, so happy to have another follow-up. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Shashank, would you like to make any remarks back?
Thank you for your response, and if I may have another question, it concerns to the vibration issues. We faced to this issue first time in SUDIP projects in Yerevan, and after it, for the first time, we started a new chapter in the M6 project, ADB financed section, and it was required to make the vibration surveys, etc., and all the needed works have been done and occurred, but still we are facing the problem with this vibration issues, because it is in the context of the policy, it is not clear what should be done after all these works. It would be better to have more clarity in the policy on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I can see Zara, you would like to respond there. Go ahead, Zara.
I would like just to add to the context, as I know that part of the project and the problems, just to the colleagues and other participants. I guess the problems Shashank mentioned came from vibration, which is defined as environmental impact as a result of the construction. And the compensations has to be paid from the land acquisition budget and should be included in the LAR. And also there have been issues with sequencing of the steps, when to plan, when to compensate. In these particular projects, there is a procedure, but the government was always raising the issue of more clarity in the policy, why they have to add vibration impact as a result of vibration in the resettlement plans, which are not direct land acquisition expenses. And I guess this was the context of the question.
Thank you, Zara. You're absolutely right.
May I chip in here?
Yes, Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a very good issue to demonstrate the importance of including impacts not caused by land acquisition, which cause damage to property, and therefore are in some way akin to economic displacement, because damaged properties need to be repaired or maybe even replaced. And bringing in provisions in the SPS update would, I think, help everybody, the affected persons as well as the agencies dealing with projects which have such impacts, to have more clarity and also have a basis for financing the mitigation of such impacts.
Thank you, Ralph. Okay, so I can also see now that Dr. Nora has posted in the chat a link to a report, and she's also saying that she's going to continue to follow up with Bruce during their meetings in January. So I'd just like to acknowledge that, and if anyone would like to see it, the link, it's in the chat. We've perhaps got a little bit more time. Knud, I see you have another question. Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, it's linked to the impacts on livelihoods not caused by land acquisition, and this is a very important topic, as also the colleague before mentioned that she's struggling with this because we have seen in project with other IFIs. Also in the regulations of other IFIs, that downstream and upstream effects, especially when it goes to, let's say, with dams or so, the limitation of the due diligence researching the upstream and downstream effects is much too limited, so that there will be probably effects on fishery or so, which is far downstream, but it's not in the scope of the due diligence. I think that the new SPS, and especially when it also comes to land acquisition and other things, has to be aware of these kinds of economic displacements that might happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Knud. Ralph, did you want to respond to that one?
Yes, briefly. Yeah, I think the point is well taken. We have projects with exactly those kind of impacts, which have led to all kinds of complaints, and even before our accountability mechanism. And that's why we do want to bring stronger provisions for the non-land acquisition related livelihood and social impacts. You mentioned impacts on fisheries. When we change the habitat of species of fish in the estuaries, in the bays, of the coastal areas, due to changes in the temperature of the water or the tidal regime, it has affected the livelihoods of the more vulnerable beach fishing communities, and we certainly feel very strong about addressing these, assessing these, and addressing and mitigating these through a process of consultation, through research into causes and consequences of these kind of changes in the environmental conditions. And, you know, in the same way as with the problem of the vibration, if there is damage caused by the project, we need to replace whatever has been damaged and lost. That is the fundamental principle of what our policy is about, if we cannot avoid them. I would even say it is very important to try and anticipate some of these impacts. In some cases, they're unanticipated because in the initial assessment, there has been a lack of attention to some of those. And we would like to strengthen that and make sure that we don't miss them and then get surprised by major complaints in the media or to our accountability mechanism.
Thank you, Ralph. Now, I think we are going to do our final call for questions or comments or remarks. So if you would like to have your opportunity, now is your time. This is the last call. So please raise your hand or type in the chat box. In particular, we haven't heard from anyone from the US. there are any of the US agencies. We haven't really heard from you much on these consultations on land acquisition this week, so we'd certainly welcome your feedback at this time. Okay. I can't see anything coming through, so on that, I'm going to hand back to Azim to end our second moderated discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Risha. And before we go and turn back to Bruce Dunn to offer his concluding remarks and a glimpse of the way forward, we have a quick Zoom poll for you that is going to be flashed on the screen now. Please rate this particular session and your satisfaction with it on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very dissatisfied and 2 being the highest score of highly satisfied. If you could do that now, we would like to replay the results of the poll question before we leave and before we hand over to Mr. Bruce Dunn. And just a reminder of the Menti poll that's going to be flashed on the chat box. There it is right now. You have at least about an hour after this session closes to provide your remarks in narrative form, 3, 4, 5 sentences would be great, on how we can improve the effectiveness of these consultations specifically. So please rank this session first on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest score and 1 being the lowest score, and then take the opportunity, please, to give some constructive feedback, offer us some advice on how to improve the effectiveness of these consultations on the Menti poll. If I could just request that we show the results of those of the Zoom poll, I can then turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn for his concluding remarks. So 83% said highly satisfied, with about 17% saying moderately satisfied. And all those comments are welcome on the Menti poll, because the ADB and everybody here understands and appreciates that there always is room for improvement, but we want to know what specific improvements can be made to improve the level of engagement, improve the discourse, and improve the opportunity for stakeholders like yourselves to have input into the safeguard policy. So with that, let me please ask Mr. Bruce Dunn to offer not only a vote of thanks, but also provide us some concluding remarks and a glimpse of the way forward. Bruce, if you please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Azim, and thanks everyone for joining today. We did have a smaller group compared to some of the other consultation sessions that we've had throughout this week. But actually, I appreciated the fact that, we've got, for example, Kanud and Nora joining from the world for some repeat consultations, because it gives us a chance to, start to have a bit more of a dialogue across these sessions. So, greatly appreciated that. But for everyone who joined, thank you very much. I think, as you know, we're going to be making a summary of this session, which we'll be sharing back with participants and also disclosing the recording. And we'll be taking all of the recommendations on board with further updates of the analytical study, so that we're representing views of different stakeholders and that we can consider that in the further development of the policy. And this will be happening in advance of us then preparing the actual draft policy, which of course will go out for further rounds of consultations. Now today, I think although we've had a small group and really questions just coming from 3 speakers today, we actually did cover quite a range of issues. Some of them, of course, we've heard in other sessions, and others we had a chance to go into a bit more depth on. So I still do have quite a few points in my notes just to mention for the summary. I'll go through those briefly. Firstly, we had some discussion around what the coverage of the future policy should be. And I think there's certainly from our side, and also recognised from other participants, that it needs to cover broadly the different forms of land acquisition, not just involuntary resettlement triggered by eminent domain laws, but looking at other forms. such as negotiated settlements, market transactions, voluntary land donations, land swaps, for example. We do think that we need to have coverage of all of those and also be clear in terms of due diligence and how you verify how the processes are implemented and making sure that they're implemented fairly. And I think as we heard in the consultation today, also making sure that those processes are truly voluntary. And of course, you can't have a process where of course, that there might be coercion and intimidation. That's not something that we would ever support. But also, it can't be voluntary if you've got the threat of then eminent domain being triggered at the end of it. And that's certainly challenging when it comes to, say, linear infrastructure projects where there's parcels of land that the government may need for a certain alignment, and then, negotiated settlement becomes a little bit more challenging. So there's definitely recognition that that needs to be covered there in the policy. Next, very briefly, we heard mention around the need for reviewing, assessing what we might call legacy issues. So land acquisition processes that may have happened in the past, maybe prior to ADB's involvement or consideration of ADB's involvement, and being clear on the scope, the need for and the scope of such assessments. Next, we had comments around how do you work within the context of domestic regulations, and then looking at the difference between regulations and actual implementation and how you review that in practice. We had some discussions around the PRC, People's Republic of China, and how that's implemented. That took us also in the direction of talking around stakeholder engagement and grievance redress mechanisms, the need to make sure that those are obviously meaningful engagement and across the entire project cycle, and that grievance redress mechanisms have to be effective. They're not there just to be a mechanism that doesn't get used, and of course it has to be culturally appropriate. We didn't go into so much detail on that today, but it's come up in other consultation sessions, certainly, so we're hearing about that as well. Implementation issues, again, I think we hear from stakeholders in all of these sessions that implementation is, of course, the most important part of the process, and that needs to be followed through and with close monitoring. Scope of due diligence was another issue. We heard about that towards the end of the session. Need to look widely at what you might call the area of influence, and certainly in upstream, downstream could be one consideration, for example, in projects involving dams and reservoirs. But having a wider consideration of the people that could be affected, including not only by land acquisition but also impacts to livelihoods. And that points to the need for stronger integration between environmental and social safeguards. That was something that's been mentioned today, and also in previous sessions. We had the example, of course, from Georgia around vibration impacts, and how that links also to potentially triggering the need for land acquisition and involuntary resettlement, but also the challenges of implementing that. And our current policy is not particularly clear on how to address those impacts. And we heard also from Ralph that that's an area that we'd like to strengthen in the new policy. And then lastly, I mentioned we had questions around co-finance and giving clarity in terms of how we operate in co-finance situations. And then lastly, the need for capacity building. So yeah, quite a spectrum of issues in a short space of time, and with a small group of stakeholders. So very much appreciated. There's 5 sessions that we've done around involuntary resettlement with about 300 participants involved across all of the various sessions. Have been extremely useful, given us a lot of food for thought in terms of the policy. So we're going to be taking all of this under review and taking the good recommendations and looking at the next steps. So again, thank you so much for joining today, and we'll look forward to also engaging with you in future sessions. So until then, stay safe, and thanks again for joining. Bye-bye.